Good morning and welcome to Class 12 of Developmental Psychology, Psych 250 at NDSU during the summer 2017 term. Today we're going to be talking about intelligence, specifically the development of intelligence and creativity and achievement in middle childhood. I just wanted to give you a reminder that we have our midterm exam review tomorrow from 5 to 7 in Menard Hall, room 232. That's the psychology department. And just another piece of housekeeping is that the front door and the apartment door lock at 5. So if you, when you get here, I'll send my phone number out again. You can just send me a text and I'll come let you in, and that way you're not off stranded outside wanting to be there. If you are planning on coming to the test review, if you could just send me an email so I know how many people to expect, and then also email me if you're planning on joining us through Google Hangouts, because if you're not planning on joining us, then I'm not going to go through to the hassle of setting it up. So just send me an email and let me know one way or the other if you're coming to the test review and what way you're going to join in. And then our midterm exam is on Friday. The way that it will work is it's an online exam, 45 multiple choice questions, and then one 5-point essay. You'll complete all of it online. You can use your book and your notes, but you cannot use the internet. You can't use your lecture material or the lecture videos, but you can use your book and your notes to do the exam. The essay, I think it should be between 4 and 6 sentences. It says on the instructions, make sure that you write an essay that meets the criteria set in the instructions. If you don't, you're not going to get full credit. So make sure that you do that. You'll have 80 minutes to complete the exam, which should be more than enough time to do it. It will auto-submit your work after 80 minutes. The exam will open at 11:59 p.m. on Thursday and close at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. On Friday. So I would recommend you have a full 24 hours to do it, and I would recommend that you not wait until the last minute to do it. So let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Today is the last day to let me know if you'd rather take a pencil and paper exam. I will make those available on Friday only, though, so you'll have to come to campus on Friday. I'm not going to do it any other day of the week. If you're just not comfortable taking an online exam, you are welcome to schedule a time on Friday to come in and take it in my office. So if you do want to do that, today's the last day. Email me by 5 o'clock so we can set that up. So let's talk about the development of intelligence in middle childhood. When I talk about intelligence, I'm sure everyone has a slightly different definition that comes to mind. Some people may say, well, it's how smart you are, or how well you are able to do in school. Other people may take the approach that intelligence really is more about your ability to utilize your different cognitive processes and your different experiences in life. and the fact that many of us have different definitions of what intelligence is really highlights the fact that there's been a lot of debate in the scientific community about what intelligence really is. There are two dominant views right now in the literature. The first is the holistic view, and this is the idea that intelligence is comprised of many different capacities: intellectual, inspirational, emotional, practical, which together form overall intelligence. In other words, the holistic approach is that the entirety of intelligence is comprised of many different things, and that everybody has varying levels of all of those things, and they all work together to make the person as intelligent or not as they are. Similarly, is is the multifaceted view of intelligence, which says that there are many different types of intelligence, and people excel at different types. So the difference here is that the holistic view would view that everyone has that intelligence is on a dimension, and that everything is, and everybody kind of falls on that in their holistic intelligent experience and their overall intelligence. Everyone is a little bit stronger leaning in one area over another. The multifaceted view views intelligence sort of as multiple continuums where people may excel in some intelligences rather than others. So the difference being, and I know those sound really similar. So for holistic, when we view it on a dimension, meaning that you've got like intellectual, inspirational, gosh, that's awful, emotional, and practical, and a person falls within one of these dimensions. So everybody has all of these intelligences, but no one's going to be right in the middle. They're going to be closer to one end or another on this dimension. Whereas the multifaceted set, what you would say, well, some people, Darcy has, pretty high visuospatial, quantitative knowledge, not as good fluid reasoning, and not as good working memory. So it's a bunch of different types of continuum where you are, better. So like pretend like this is a 0 and this is like 100, and so you'd be ranked, by where you stand on these different facets of intelligence. So let's look at some different models and theories of how intelligence, of how psychologists propose intelligence is. The first is Spearmans Model. And Spearmans Model proposes that there's a thing called general intelligence, and this is called Spearman's G. And general intelligence is just your overall intelligence, level of intelligence. And so he divides intelligence into two distinct sets of factors. So the first is the G factor, and this is your general intelligence, the measure of your broad level intelligence. This is your overall intelligence score. Your S factor are specific intelligences. So there's more than one S factor, and it's a measure of intelligence for multiple factors that make up intelligence. And within Spearman's model, although there are specialized skills, all test items share in the G factor. So just to highlight how this is, Spearman says there's a general intelligence, so your G factor, okay? And all of these specific intelligences, your individual S factors, contribute equally to your G factor. So an example would be, in this class there are 2 exams, and so the 2 exams, the 2 little E factors, all contribute to the overall E factor, or your exam grade as a whole. And so at the end of the semester, the grade book will have exams out of 100, and then that exams out of 100 will be comprised of the 2 exams that you took. And so that's what Spearman proposes happens with intelligence. You have this general intelligence, which is your overall score, and then you have all these other individual subscores for different types of intelligence that may exist. An alternate model that builds upon Spearman's model is Cattell's model. And Cattell divided G factor into 2 types. So he said, well, I agree there's this thing called G factor, like your overall intelligence, and I believe that it's made up of these individual specific components. But I think that the G there are 2 different types of general intelligence. There's fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And so instead of there being one G, he said there are two Gs. And different, oh gosh, this is awful, and different S factors that play into that. One of the G factors is fluid intelligence, and the other is crystallized intelligence. And so fluid intelligence is our ability to solve new problems, use logic, and identify problems. So when I give you a discussion board question that asks you to think about how you would be in the future and what you would do in the future, that would be an example of you using your fluid intelligence. You're solving a new problem, you're using logic. Crystallized intelligence is your ability to use learned knowledge and experience. In other words, that would be like an example of crystallized intelligence is taking some kind of test where you've already learned this information, you're just regurgitating it, you're providing it. So crystallized intelligence is what you have retained, the information that you've retained, whereas fluid intelligence is the ability to create meaning out of an abstract idea. Sternberg's theory is slightly different, and it's called Sternberg's triarchic theory, triarchic meaning three. Excuse me. And Sternberg proposed that there are three intelligences, each of which involves separate metacognitive processes. So the first is the analytic intelligence, and this is our ability to think abstractly and evaluate information. Our creative intelligence is our ability to come up with solutions to solve problems. And our practical intelligence is our ability to cope with concrete problems. And this would take the form of adapting skills to meet the needs of the problem, changing the context that you're thinking in or working in to meet the problem, or to meet the skills that you have, and then selecting appropriate contexts in which to solve problems. And so, under Sternberg's theory, our analytic intelligence would be our ability to, would be how the ease to which, how well we are able to think in a more logical way that's not as concrete, but doesn't require us to be thinking about something that is tangible in front of us. It's sort of like a more philosophical way of thinking, where you're like, let me think about and explain justice, which is we've discussed last time as an abstract concept. And our creative intelligence would be our ability to come up with something, to create something new. How well we write things, how well we plan things, how well we come up with ideas. And then practical, of course, is using our skills to solve an actual tangible problem that presents itself. And so you can kind of see as we move forward, and you'll see especially with the next one, that we're moving away from this sort of traditional view that intelligence is purely how much you know and how well you know it. It's more complicated than that. It's not what we know, but it's the way that we use it and how well that we use it. Gardner came up with what he calls the multiple intelligences, and these are 8 independent culturally valued activities. Things like linguistic intelligence, how well we can speak and use our language. Logico-mathematical, this is our ability to do use quantitative logic, do mathematics, etc. Musical, so how well we can do musical activities. Spatial, our ability to our ability to draw and to discern the dimension of the world. Our, sports athletics would go into this in some way, because we do require some spatial awareness in order to do that. Bodily kinesthetic, our ability to engage in physical activity and how well we do it. Naturalistic, which is, I don't remember that one. Okay, the naturalistic intelligence is using, our ability to discern things in nature and to understand and organize patterns in the natural environment. And then interpersonal is our ability to sorry, good grief. Interpersonal intelligence is our ability to relate to other people and to live in community with others in a peaceful and productive way. And then intrapersonal is our internal relationship, our inner life, and how connected we are to our own experiences and how well we know ourselves. And so Gardner's multiple intelligence really veers away from this traditional Western idea of what it means to be intelligent, and looks at the whole person and looks at how they themselves, what their strengths are. So it's not like everyone has to meet the same standard. Some people can be better intrapersonally than they are linguistically, or they can be better bodily kinesthetically than they are musically, and that's okay. It's not that you have to have this Renaissance person who is able to do all these things very well. This values the differences in people's lives, and in people's personalities, and in people's experiences. So now that we've covered the basic theories that make up intelligence, let's talk about how we measure that. So we talked about during the first week of class that that Binet was the first person to come up with an intelligence test, and the point of an intelligence test was to be able to put people in academic settings that were appropriate for them. So, we've built upon this tradition in psychology by creating more complex and sophisticated intelligence tests. And the goal of intelligence testing ultimately is to determine how well a person has developed cognitively, and how to project how well they'll do academically. So we standardize IQ tests. Meaning the scores are designed such that the average will be 100 always. And so we rank people in this bell-shaped curve. See the middle, the average is 100. And so we rank people's scores on this bell-shaped curve. So if you have a score that falls between 100 and 115, you're above average. If you have a score of 130, you're well above average. And so 95% of respondents are going to fall between 70 to 130 when it comes to intelligence, or 95% of the population, and 68% are going to fall within one standard deviation of the average score. And so you can see then that 14% of the population is going to be here, and then 2% of the population is going to be here, and then less than 0.1% is going to be higher than 145. So, you know, if you want to have a good IQ, you want to try to be in this little 14% area. That's a very good IQ. But if you have 100 or a little over 100, that's also good as well. Less than this is when we start to have problems, and so you don't really want to be below average when it comes to IQ. So how stable is a person's intelligence? Is intelligence something that we have from the time that we're born that just kind of stays the same across our lifespan, or does it change? So in terms of stability, whether or not our intelligence changes at all, the closer in time you take a person's IQ score, the higher the correlation. So what I mean by that is, if you wait a long period of time to test someone's intelligence, there's not going to be a high correlation between the two scores, meaning they're not going to be very much the same. And so if you were to test someone's IQ at 2 and then retest it at 18, there's going to be a pretty weak, so 0.31 positive correlation between those two scores, meaning they're not going to be that stable. But if you do it within like a 3-year period, so you test it at 7 and test it again at 10, there is going to be a high correlation. So the more you, the older you get, the higher your IQ score goes. But when we get older, though, the older we get, the more our IQ stabilizes. So by 18, so if we take the measure at 7 and we take it again at 18, we're going to have a fairly stable IQ. It's not going to really, we're not going to see too steady an increase. And it's fairly stable after the age of 6. So, for example, after the age of 6, we see a much higher maturity level. Children are more sophisticated. They're able to engage in the tests of the intelligence tests, which are complicated and require you to really have a higher maturity level. And there's also a more stabilized school environment. So before the age of 6, kindergarten, preschool, it's not as structured academically. I mean, it is, but it's not uniform because there aren't standard, state standards for kindergarten and preschool in the same way that there are for, primary school. Because it's not required that you go to school before the age of 6. And so when you have this more stabilized school environment, it's easier for children to have higher IQ scores because they are being exposed to actually standardized education that will show up again on the IQ test. They're actually going to have been trained and equipped to answer those questions. Not that they'll know the answer to the question because they've been given it, but because that task will have been something that's been primed by their education. Just because your IQ is stable does not mean that it can't be changed. So if you have a low IQ, you're not stuck with it for the rest of your life. It can increase, it can get better. In fact, we've seen fluctuations in IQ between 10 to 20 points. And so like if you're at 100 and you fluctuate 20 points, that's 120 in IQ. That's really good. People who see increases or gains in their IQ are those who are motivated to succeed at school. So if you're motivated and you're trying really hard to do well in school, you're going to see an increase most likely going to see an increase in your IQ score. High parental support is another factor that is associated with increases in IQ. So if you have parents who support you, who are encouraging of you, who help your self-esteem, then you're going to do better in your IQ test. And then if you live in a home where there's democratic discipline styles, so where it's not harsh or it's positive punishment, children are much more likely to see an increase in IQ because they don't get anxious about getting things wrong. That's the biggest thing I think that drains people that drains people on IQ tests is they start to get anxious that they're going to get something wrong. And so they get nervous and their performance slips. So if you're not conditioned to being scared of doing the wrong thing, which is what happens when you have harsh punishment, non-positive punishment, then you're going to be distracted. You're going to feel anxious about getting things wrong. People who see declines in their intelligence, so when I say it fluctuates as much as 10 to 20 points, they could also get worse. You could go from 100 to 80. So what, the different factors that play into that lead into decline would be low parental involvement. So if your parents aren't involved, you don't have that high self-esteem that comes with having highly involved parents. And then if you live in poverty, this is what's called a cumulative deficit. In other words, poverty sucks the life out of so many different parts of your existence. Your physical development is affected, and then because of that, your cognitive development is affected, and your social development can be affected, as well as your emotional development, your academic development. All these things can slip as a result of poverty, and so the result, the cumulative deficit of all these reductions due to poverty is that your IQ can slip. So why is knowing your IQ score and why is having a good IQ important? Well, IQ, or intelligence, is associated with different things in later development. So your IQ is a strong predictor of your achievement and grades at school. So people with higher IQ tend to do better in school, tend to have better grades in school. But, that being said, the more years you're in school, the higher your IQ is. So it could be that the two are mutually inclusive. In other words, you're seeing better academics because of your IQ, but you're seeing a higher IQ because of your academics. So it may be that it's a false correlation, which is why it's important to remember that just because there's a correlation doesn't necessarily mean it causes it. IQ is also a predictor of occupational attainment. So people with higher IQs tend to have better achievements at work, and it also predicts success in occupation of choice. So if you have a high IQ, you're most likely going to be successful at what you do in your job. Now, some people thought, well, maybe IQ could be associated with your psychological adjustment. Well, there's no association with psychological adjustment. You don't have to have a high IQ to be psychologically adjusted. So that's good. It just seems to be associated with development of your academic and vocational skills. So are there cultural biases in IQ tests? And this has been a question of great debate in the last couple of decades. And the question is, are IQ tests fair to children from different cultural backgrounds? And the reason we ask this question is we've noticed several very disturbing trends. First, IQ tests show marked differences between white populations and ethnic minority populations. In other words, on a whole, people who are white, who identify as white, have higher IQs than people who are from an ethnic minority population. So people who are black, people who are Latino, people who are Native. An exception to that would be people who are Asian tend to also do well. Do well in IQ tests. And so the reason this is a red flag is that if a test is not biased, if it is a good non-biased measure of the construct of interest, you should see an even distribution of points across ethnic groups, across any personal characteristics. Everybody, it'll be proportional, right? According to that group in society's proportion to the population. But we would expect to see that the same proportion of people in each population would have about the same levels of scores. But when you have such a marked difference, statistically speaking, between one group over another, that indicates one of two things. First, that there's something intrinsically different about the groups that you're looking at. In other words, people who are white are potentially intellectually superior to people who are not white. So that is one potential explanation. It is the wrong explanation, but it is one potential explanation. And the reason we know it's wrong is that people who are Asian also score well on IQ tests. So it has nothing to do then with some racial groups being more superior than others. Even though people have used this as an explanation as to why segregationism is okay. It's not. That is the wrong explanation. The other thing that this marked difference would suggest is that the test has a slant. It has a bias towards certain populations over others. And the thing that white populations and the Asian populations tend to have in common is, one, they tend to be of higher socioeconomic status, and they tend to have more parents having achieved some form of academic degree. And so this would suggest that there is, in fact, some kind of slant. And the second explanation or argument that IQ tests are unfair to people from different cultural backgrounds is the norms largely are based on white populations. In other words, our testing that we do as psychologists, largely if you look at the studies and you look at the population or the sample demographics, you'll see that the vast majority of the people who respond on these studies are white and educated. So when we're creating norms, what you do is you have a large group of the population complete your tests, and then you score the tests, and then you come up with percentiles. And so you say, okay, the average is 100, and X percent of people fall above this, and X percent fall below this. And you rank people, and you score people, and you tell them what their IQ is based on where they fall within these percentile ranks. So if your population is largely white, that means that your norms that you're judging people off of, that the score that you're giving them is then based upon a different population than yourself. And it's not fair to compare white children to black children, white children to Latinx children, because of the different experiences that those two groups have had. Our main IQ tests they're always in development, but a lot of the norms that we have were based in a very, very soon after our post-segregation school system. Well, you can't segregate entire groups of people and have white children in good schools and children of color in subpar schools where they don't have accurate textbooks and they don't have the best teachers and they don't have school supplies, and then expect them to do equally well. And so those norms are not fair. They create an impossible hurdle for most people to jump over. And people will make the argument, well, we don't live in a segregated society anymore. Everyone has the same opportunity, but you have to remember it's only been 50 years since segregation ended. My dad is 50 years old, meaning segregation ended about the time my dad was born. So in one generation, you can't expect an entire group of people to improve academically, intellectually, when you consider the different factors, such as high parental support, motivation to succeed in school, democratic discipline, and the factors that reduce it, low parental involvement and poverty. Well, if you think about these populations, if you've got a parent who maybe didn't get to go to college or didn't have a good education because they grew up during segregation, they're probably going to have to work a lot of jobs to support their family, so you're not going to have as much support. You're not going to have as much involvement. And you're not going to be motivated to succeed. Most black children are not, and Latinx children and Native children are not considered by their teachers to be worth the investment because they're not going to go to college. Statistically, they're less likely to go, so we implicitly, and this is racism, think that, well, there's no point in trying to educate them, they're not going to do well anyway. So then you're not motivated to succeed. And you have to remember poverty. These populations largely live in poverty, and so the cumulative deficits of that are going to reduce their IQ. And so it's going to be, it's not fair to use these norms. Lastly, cultural differences may impact test results for minorities. And we don't think about this, but different cultures view things and do things in different ways and learn in different ways. White culture and white learning styles are largely based on retention of information. We sit in a lecture, we get spoken to, we're expected to memorize the information and regurgitate it. That is by and large the way that white people learn. People of color, though, are different. I'm not as familiar with the Latinx culture, but in terms of African Americans, I grew up in the South. I grew up in a community that was about 50% white, 50% black, and I've seen this firsthand, but black communities tend to be much more narrative in their learning. Learning is facilitated through stories. It's facilitated through making personal connections with the material. The same goes for Native populations. They tend to be more narrative in their learning. Because I grew up in a culture that was 50% African American, the South is actually also a very narrative culture, even among white people. And it's interesting, and the reason for this is because, it's unfortunately a product of racism, but because of slavery and because of the segregation, a lot of white children were raised by black nannies, and so those nannies would be usually the first person to introduce any kind of learning to the child, and they would do so through a narrative style. So Southerners actually are very narrative in their learning as well, and so potentially why Southerners don't do as well on national standardized tests, because they're designed for a non-narrative cultural experience. And so this cultural difference may actually impact test results for minorities. You're all like, all these little cogs are taking like, oh, this is why Dorothy talks so much and tells so many stories. Yes, I'm a very narrative person. Drove my class crazy last semester. Some people like it, some people don't. I learn better if I can have a story attached to it. The problem is, it's hard to create culturally unbiased tests. So, if we address these issues, so that the issue that the experience is different, so that of each culture is different, so the norms cannot be, the norms are unfair. We can't. If, I'm trying to think of a way to say this where it doesn't sound offensive. if deficits in IQ are to be attributed to the fact that a group of people have not had the same educational opportunities as other people, then we have to consider that the norms that exist are the ideal. That this is what a person should, if they're treated with respect, they're treated with dignity, they have an actual equal educational experience, then the norms that we have are what we would expect to see. So from those regards, the norms there's nothing wrong with the norms. The problem is that we're holding people who can never attain those norms, or who have a least likely chance to attain those norms to the standards. The alternative is then to lower the norm to be more holistic of our society, or to be a more holistic representation of our society. The problem with that is that we then create these high levels of outliers, where we have these people who are based on the current norms, incredibly intelligent. If we lower the average to like 80, those people are going to be way out there. It's going to, it's not going to be 0.1%. It's going to be 0.005%, and so that creates outliers, which then skew our data. So from a statistical standpoint, lowering the average or making the norms more attainable for people is not helpful from a research perspective. It's not helpful from the whole point of why we do testing. So that's an issue. The other issue is creating tests that are accessible to other cultures can create a problem, because then it's no longer a standardized test. If we are to have a standardized IQ test, everybody has to do the exact same thing. You can't have something that's different for other people, because then that inflates the scores. It makes a 100 look different depending on, the characteristics of a 100 score look different across the board. And so you start to see it's very difficult to measure IQ in a way that isn't biased. What's the answer to this? Well, we don't have one. I would say a good place to start is making sure that education is truly accessible to all, and that everyone actually does have an equal experience in their ability to do well in school, and that everyone's treated the same way, and that everyone is encouraged to do the best that they can, in such a way that we then lift other populations up towards what would be expected if they were treated as equals in society. Another potential, and this is what we do in clinical psychology when we're doing assessments, is you have to keep in mind the cultural experience of the person that you're testing, and you have to make allowances for that when you're scoring it. In other words, if a person is having difficulty with a task, you have to come up with a way to give them the same task, but in a way that they can understand it. And so that's a little difficult, but, it's, I think, worth the effort. The reality is, though, until we have a truly equal society, we're going to still see these biases, and it's not pleasant, but it's something that we're going to have to work towards to make the world a better place. And as the future professionals of this country, that's your job. So congratulations, you can have it. When it comes to intelligence, the nature versus nurture debate is in full swing. And it all started in the 60s. And it started with Arthur Jensen. And Jensen proposed that individual race and SES differences are due to heredity. In other words, what he would argue is that people of color have a lower IQ, and that's because of some kind of intrinsic part of their nature. That black people are just not as smart as we are, as white people are, that Latinos are not as smart as white people are. And this is a very racist and white supremacist way of thinking. And you have to, I mean, any person could be offended by this, because what he's arguing is that your personal experience is a result of your nature. So in other words, if you're poor, it's because you've inherited some kind of gene that makes you more likely to be poor. And so that's offensive, because most of us who are poor are not poor because of any part of our, individual makeup. It's not because we're less smart or because we're less hard workers. It's just we're a nation of immigrants, and you don't. My family, my ancestry. I'm from Northern Ireland. My family's from the city of Belfast. My dad's family, my mom's family, is from France, and we immigrated during the potato famine, like most Irish Americans did. And we came with nothing. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs, and worked as in the fields as farm laborers, because that's what we could do, because the Irish were discriminated against when they got to the U.S. They were treated like garbage. Imagine how we treat Latinos today in the United States. That's how Irish were treated 100 years ago. And so you don't recover from that. It's not like you can work so hard and save all your money. If you're getting like a couple dollars a day, you're not going to be able to save that up and really become a wealthy individual. And so to argue that a person is poor because of something in their genetics is insulting, because it completely excludes that history, that story, that narrative. The book, The Bell Curve, added to the debate, and it was equally offensive. I was kind of rereading some of it last night when I was preparing for class, and I was just blown away by the lack of awareness these incredibly intelligent people have for other people and their experiences. But in this book, the authors argue that human intelligence is substantially influenced by both inherited and environmental factors, and is a better predictor of many personal dynamics, including financial income, job performance, birth out of wedlock, and involvement in crime, than are a person's parental socioeconomic status. And they also argue that those with high intelligence are cognitive elite, and they're separate from those of average and below average intelligence. And the biggest controversy in this book is that they talk about racial differences in intelligence. And essentially say that people of color just are not as smart. So this added to the debate. The reality is, when you do good statistical research of intelligence, most research shows that these theories do lack strong empirical support. In other words, they're not completely unfounded. There are elements of truth to what they're saying. However, it's not strong. It's very weak. In other words, they're clutching at straws when they're making these arguments. And you can usually explain these things these differences that they see if you look at other factors. So in other words, there's not a lot of nature in this mug. Like, people are not less intelligent because of their biology. Mostly it's due to their environmental factors. Any kind of biological link that you can see, any kind of heredity link that you can see. So in other words, your parents were poor and you're poor, your parents have low IQ and you have low IQ, can be generally attributed to environmental factors. And so it's not necessarily that you've inherited a gene, it's that you inherited an experience, a lived experience. Now, if we're looking at more rigorous tests, heritability estimates are about 0.5, meaning it's about a 50-50 shot that your IQ is going to be related to your heritability. 0.5 is a strong, it's a moderate to strong correlation. It's not bad. All this means is that there is somewhat of a positive correlation between your heredity, the genes between the experience of your parents or other members of your family and your own. And McGew found in 1981 that the correlation among identical twins reared apart is higher than for fraternal twins reared together. In other words, twin studies are really important. Identical twins are identical biologically speaking, and so what he found is that among twins, there is a very high correlation that if one twin has a high IQ, the other twin will also have a high IQ. So that does demonstrate that there is some kind of biological component to IQ. We're not saying that that is not true. But we also have to consider the nurture side of this argument. In adoption studies are studies in which we look at twins who are separated and then adopted. These studies show that the children raised in more advantageous homes or more advantaged homes develop higher IQs than children who are adopted into less advantaged homes. So in other words, it could be that twins reared apart, these twins reared apart, were both in similar homes, and so given those similar environments did very well. Whereas if you were to put a person in a richer home, in a home where they have access to tutors and better schools, they're going to have a better IQ than those who are in a less advantaged home. For your discussion today, I want you to consider the following, and this may be a little raw for people based on their quiz score. I don't think anyone made a D on the last quiz, but I think they did anyway. Yeah, I think the lowest score was a C. So, imagine that you received a D on your last exam. Why did you get a poor grade on the exam? How well do you think you would do on the next exam? And how do you think you would do on your next exam in another of your classes? I want you to think about that. Imagine that you got a D on your last exam, and I want you to think about those different questions. Okay, I want you to think about that. And I want you to answer those questions. And what I would really like for you to do is I'd like for you to answer those questions before you continue with the lecture. So at this point, I would really prefer for you to pause the lecture and actually respond to this question. So when it comes to IQ, we also have to consider achievement. And achievement is our ability to see increases in our intellectual ability. And so when we as psychologists study achievement, we have to look at two different things. First, what motivation do people have to achieve? What is their psychological need to attain intellectual excellence? And then what attributions do they make to achievement? What skills and activities are associated with making academic gains? So we've developed different criteria to judge this. The first is an internal or stable motivation, academic motivation. And this internal stable motivation depends upon or hinges upon the attribution that achievement is based on ability. So, I am smart or I am stupid, and that is internal and stable. It's something that you can't really do anything about. Your achievement is completely based on your internal characteristics and your internal abilities. Another motivation and a motivation attribution is internal unstable, and this is effort-based. So in other words, our ability to achieve is based on our own effort, and it's based on something within us, but it's not stable. So like an example would be, I tried, but I didn't try hard enough. So I didn't do well because I didn't try hard enough, or I did well because I tried hard enough. Opposite of that are the external attributions of achievement. And so external stable is the difficulty of the task. In other words, there's something intrinsic about the task, the outside of the person that made you not do as well. So it was an easy task or it was hard. It was a hard test, it was a difficult test, so I didn't do well. And then external unstable, and this is based on luck. So I just got lucky or I was unlucky when it came to this test. So it had nothing to do with me or my own efforts. It had everything to do with the fact that it just was not my day. And so what I'd like for you to do for your discussion, so just going back to that slide, is I want you to figure out which attribution you use for number 1. Okay? So which of these attributions, which of these motivation and attribution grids would you use to describe this? And if you do that correctly, then I will give you a quarter of a point on your discussions for this week. Now, when it comes to our motivation and our attributions, we find ourselves often in one of two directions. One is a mastery-oriented direction, and this is how well we're able to persist at difficult tasks. And psychologically, we see our success as due to our ability, and our failure is due to low effort or difficult task. And so this is a more stable view of, if you were to look at here, this would be the stable orientation, right? Because it's due to ability or due to, this is internal. No, stable. I'm right. It was stable. And then failure is due to the difficulty of the task and the amount of effort you put into it. Within this mastery-oriented mindset, we have the incremental theory of intelligence, which explains that intelligence can be improved by effort. In other words, you are able to improve your intelligence if you just work hard enough. And for this reason, people in this in this orientation will set learning goals. They want to learn, they want to evaluate themselves by how much that they're learning. The other side of this is learned helplessness, and this is the second orientation that a person could fall in. And this is when you give up easily and you experience depression because of your lack of achievement. And the attributions here are success are due to a lack of luck, or due to luck. So you're only successful because you were lucky. Your failures are due to your low ability. In other words, you do well because you were lucky, and you don't do well because you're just not smart. And the theory that drives this mindset is, or explains this mindset, is the entity theory of intelligence, and that is that intelligence is unchangeable. In other words, we have what we have. We can't make it better. There's nothing that we can do to make it better. And so, we're either lucky or we just are not very smart. And people within this mindset set performance goals. Set performance goals. They want to perform well, and they rate themselves and they rate their ability off of how well they perform, how proficient they are in their tasks. So, what makes us motivated to achieve? Well, the adults in our lives can influence achievement motivation. Adults who communicate pity after failures, who offer unsolicited help, or who attribute failures to low ability can reduce a student's motivation. When you communicate a pity after a failure, it's as if you're making some kind of value judgment. Whereas if you say, well, you can do better next time, it's not a big deal. You didn't do well this time, but you can do better. That's helpful because that encourages them to try harder and to work harder. Whereas if you're like, oh, I'm so sorry, that's awful, it reinforces this idea that it's luck or that there's something wrong with you and you're not smart enough to do it. Also, offering unsolicited help, you would think, oh, I'm offering to help this person, and that will make them feel more competent. It actually has the opposite effect. It makes people perceive that you see them as stupid or incompetent, or that they're not able to figure it out. Whereas if you say, I'm here if you need help, then that communicates to the student or to your child, that you're available to give them help, but you give them you trust their judgment enough to know when they need it. And then adults, obviously, adults attribute lack of achievement to low ability. So you're like, oh, this person is just, you didn't do well because you're just not good at math. And so you didn't do well in your math test because you're just not good at it. So that sends the message that there's some kind of deficiency in that person's abilities. And what we've found is that girls and minority students are more likely to receive these messages, which is one potential reason why girls and minorities tend to not do as well in certain subjects in school, because they're being continuously told that they're not good at it. One thing that has been developed in order to fix this problem is attribution retraining, and this was developed by Sandra Graham. And this is when you enhance motivation and encourage achievement by changing how students think about their academic successes and failures so that their beliefs work for rather than against their chances for academic success. And I do this all the time, and if you ever come to my office, I challenge you to call me out when I'm doing it, because then it'll impress me that you remembered. But I've had students in the past who come to my office and say, I'm just stupid, I can't do this, I don't understand. And my response is always to try to retrain that. Well, you've never been asked to do it before, so you're not expected to be good at it. The whole point of doing this is that you learn, and that you're asking for help shows that you know yourself well enough to seek advice from someone who does know, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I wish more people would do that. And that increases motivation because you're telling the student they can do it. They're smart enough to do it. They're smart enough to know they need help, and that asking for help doesn't mean that they're not smart. And this has been shown to really improve academic motivation and academic performance across a semester or two. Lastly, a central part of IQ and a part of achievement is a person's creativity, their ability to create new things. And we think of creativity as being synonymous with artistic pursuits, but the reality is designing a electric grid is just as creative as painting a picture, because the root of creative is create, the ability to take your intellect, to take your abilities and your achievement and combine them into some kind of tangible outcome. And there are two major ways of thinking about creativity. The first is convergent thinking, and this is thinking that involves determining the correct or expected answer, which does not involve much creativity. So, for example, multiple choice tests is a form of convergent thinking or convergent creativity. You're creating something, but your creation is not as reliant upon your ability to create something new as much as your ability to recall information and assemble it in the appropriate way. The opposite of this is divergent thinking, and this is thinking involving abstract reasoning that involves much creativity. So writing an essay, for example, you're having to think abstractly. You don't have a tangible set of answers that you're having to discern. You've been given a task, and you have to use your knowledge in a creative way to communicate what you're expected to communicate. I want to thank you for your attention today. For Class Smart, it's our last class before the midterm, our last class of middle childhood. I want you to read pages 329 to 355. And I want you to think about this question: what is perspective taking? How is our ability to engage in perspective taking related to our emotional and social development? So think about these things and ponder them in your hearts. It's a reference from the Nativity story, if you didn't pick up on it. I saw a spelling mistake and it's bothering me. Here it is. So think about those questions while you read. Remember that our midterm is Friday, our exam review is Thursday. Please send me an email. Let me know if you're planning on coming to the campus or if you're going to join in online for the exam review. Remember, you can also ask questions on the discussion board. Many of you have been doing that. Very good. And then there's nothing due today, so just read and study. If you need me, have any questions, please send me an email at darcy.corbitt, C-O-R-B-I-T-T, Hall, H-A-L-L, @ndsu.edu, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a good day.